Today we're going to use a hack to try and get 120 FPS out of a Canon EOS R in 1080p. What's up guys, my name's George. I'm a photographer and videographer based in Leeds. On this channel I create content all around photography, videography and tech surrounding that. So if you're interested in any of that, be sure to subscribe and welcome to the channel. Today we are using the Canon EOS R to see if we can get double the frame rate out of its 1080p mode. Double the frame rate. Just so you know, for this process I will be using 25p and 50p because I'm based in the UK, and in the UK we use PAL and not NTSC. If you're unsure of what those things are, feel free to research it. But yes, I shoot in PAL, so for this process I was shooting in 25p and 50p in order to double up my frame rates up to 50p and then 100p. We all know that if you're a Canon shooter and you're not shooting on a 1DX Mark II, you are limited to 50p or 60p when you are shooting in 1080 Full HD. This is something that's hopefully going to be fixed in future Canon mirrorless cameras, including the R5, the R6 and whatever else they decide to do. But for now, we're stuck with this limitation. But I think following some recent experiments, I might have found a hack to try and double up your frame rate to get to near 100 FPS, 120 FPS. Roughly a year ago I started editing on Davinci Resolve 16, just the free version, but within Davinci Resolve I started experimenting with the optical flow feature in the retime and rescaling panel. Already I know you're thinking, okay, optical flow, yeah, you can maybe get a few frames out of it, but can you double it? Can you double your frame rate? I decided that I wanted to conduct a couple of experiments. These experiments were to shoot at 25 FPS at a normal 180 shutter rule, so 1/50th of a second, then at 50 FPS at a shutter of 1/100th of a second. Then on both of these, on 25 FPS, I wanted to double the shutter speed to overcrank to increase the sharpness of each of those frames. So that meant 25 FPS being shot at 1/100 and then 50 FPS being shot at 1/200. So that when I used optical flow in Davinci Resolve 16, the optical flow had a better shot of creating sharper linked together images. Alongside these experiments, I wanted to use one take that was shot in 720p 100 FPS, which is the goal frame rate that we're trying to get to here, but sadly on the EOS R you can only use that in 720p. So we're using that as a comparison to see how well our optical flow 1080 worked out. In order to conduct this experiment, I went out into our local park in Leeds and shot the same shots of fairly fast motion of me doing like a little jump off a tree. I used the same shot so that I could compare each of these frame rates and edits to see how good the motion is. So, over to George in the field. I'm not going to make you watch every one of those takes, so we'll go into Davinci Resolve, use our optical flow effect, and see how these compare. Within Davinci Resolve, you take your clip, drop it down on the timeline. This is one of our 50 FPS clips with a normal shutter speed of 1/100th of a second. Then, within the inspector of that clip, go down to your retime and rescaling and select optical flow. Allow that clip to render, and now we have our test. First, let's take a look at our normal 25 frames per second, 1/150 without the optical flow, just so I can demonstrate what optical flow does. At a first glance, you can see it's jerky. It looks like bad slow motion when you try to get slow motion out of your footage when your camera does not support it. This is not what we want. Once we add optical flow onto these clips, we get something a little bit better. As a comparison for what the 25 frames per second with optical flow was trying to achieve, here is 50 frames a second at half speed. This is essentially the goal of the 25 frames a second. Have a look and see how they compare. Clearly, it was not a close race. The 50 frames a second at half speed looks way more natural because that's what that frame rate is intended for. The 25p wasn't even close. Still with 25 FPS, trying to capture fast motion like this even with optical flow, looks a bit jerky. This test specifically is asking quite a lot from the frame rates because it is quite fast motion, so optical flow is trying to find frames while the subject is moving quite quickly. Now let's look at 25 frames per second, 1/100th with optical flow applied. Obviously this is still 25 frames a second, so you are not going to get decent slow-mo out of this, but optical flow with the overcranked shutter has actually gotten us a slightly better result. Next up, we have 50 frames a second, 1/100 using optical flow. Immediately to my eye, this looks a lot better than the 25p slowed down. It's trying to accomplish an even slower speed, but it comes out looking much smoother. Now let's look at 50 frames a second, 1/200, so an overcranked shutter to get sharper frames. Let's see that with optical flow. This gets us even closer. This overall looks much smoother than the 25p and even the 1/100. I think the 1/200 using optical flow is the closest we can really get. As a comparison, I'd like to show you the 720p, 100 frames a second, 1/200 shutter speed, alongside our 50 frames a second, 1/200 using optical flow. You can see the optical flow struggling with the edges of my body as I'm going through the air as it's trying to make up frames. But you got to remember, this is very fast motion. This is someone flying through the air, not that dramatically given that, but it's still someone flying through the air. If you were to try this on a slightly slower moving subject, if you're just trying to get a couple more seconds out of a shot to make the motion a little bit smoother, you could really get a lot out of this using optical flow. Even with a normal 180-degree shutter rule, you can still use optical flow to slow down your footage a little bit. But I think using the overcranked shutter gets you overall much sharper frames that results in a smoother shot. That's it for today's experiment. I wanted to see if this worked. It wasn't a complete success, but I still think I learned something. I've now realized that I can use optical flow a little more heavily than I had previously thought. I hope you found this useful. If you have, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment and like down below. And until next time, I'm out.